Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
Soybeans are found on dinner tables around the world. Some form of the soybean is found in baby foods, snacks, cooking oils, and many other food items eaten daily. And soybeans provide the protein in the diets for livestock and fish. The Nebraska soybean farmers support research to develop new soy-based products for foods, livestock, and industrial uses through their checkoff dollars. The Nebraska Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Market Journal, television for making agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Extension, where you can know how, know now. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We're reporting this week from Husker Harvest Days. Started in 1978, this show is located on 1,000 acres of land just west of Grand Island. With over 600 exhibitors, it's also the nation's largest farm show where all field crops and crop technology plots are irrigated. On the show this week, our market analysts are Arlan Suderman and John Otte from Farm Progress. We'll look at nitrates in corn stalks with Rick Rasby, and Ron Pavelka will give us an update from the Nebraska Soybean Board. On Wednesday morning, the USDA released its latest crop production report. It estimates U.S. corn yield at 122.8 bushels per acre. The country's total production is down 1% from last month and would be the lowest since 2006. The agency forecasts harvested acres for grain at 87.4 million. On the soybean side, production is down 2% from August, with yields expected to average 35.3 bushels per acre. Arlan Suderman joined us after the release on Wednesday morning, a somewhat unpleasant day here on the grounds, as high winds forced organizers to close the show early around 3 o'clock. The hand-washed Market Journal van didn't stand a chance. In a relatively calm machine shed, we talked with Arlan about the grain market outlook and if the latest USDA forecast adds up.
Well, it's tough to add up the numbers. USDA had to make some assumptions on soybeans because ending stocks are bare pipeline supplies. So any drop in production had to result in a drop in demand. And then they have to assume that price will do that rationing of demand down the road. And the markets seem to understand that pretty well in the soybean market. They don't grasp that as much in the corn market. There's a couple things that don't really add up on the corn market. First of all, their harvested acreage estimate. Our surveys show that harvested acreage will be about 3.5 million acres below where USDA is at. And I think the data supports that pretty strongly. If you look at previous years with a drought, even another 3.5 million acres off of that would still be a very high percentage harvested versus planted for a year like this. And I think the reports, the anecdotal reports, would support that as well. The other thing is what's happening on a global scale. Seeing stocks continue to tighten up. USDA is failing to acknowledge that. And overall, when you put wheat and corn together, since they're so interchangeable, the USDA is calling for about a 2.7 billion bushel swing in demand. I just don't see that happening without higher prices.
This is the first time we've really seen yield not drop off precipitously in one of the crop reports. Does that mean that it's hard to argue that the high is still in store?
Well, there's a lot of people arguing that, okay, USDA's got the yield figured out, so therefore the high is behind us. And I would say, okay, demand cannot exceed supply. We still think the corn crop is smaller than USDA projects. We think it's close to 9.86 billion bushels and have data to support that. The soybean crop, they're probably getting close, although I still think it's going to be edge a little bit smaller than that. But in the end, demand cannot exceed supply. And we're still seeing the demand out there, the corn moving out the door, exceed the level that will be supported by the size of the crop, and definitely see that in soybeans. We don't see soybean demand being rationed at all yet. If anything, it's increasing.
Do you have a level in mind there, a price level in mind that you think demand might start to ration at?
I believe that corn is going to have to dramatically slow ethanol production and livestock production, and I think it's going to take a price above $9, even if we get a waiver of the RFS in order to do that. Soybeans, I think it's going to take a price above 20. That doesn't mean it'll happen next week, or next month. It may have to be next spring when that happens, but I believe that's what's going to have to take place.
Let me just ask you one more about ethanol. You mentioned rationing there. When does it happen, though? I mean, we've sort of hit a lull here from the onslaught of publicity of mandating a waiver here. Do you think that continues?
Yeah, and we got about a 2-week extension of the comment period this week. So I expect that after election we may see a waiver of the renewable fuel standard to some extent, but I do not think it'll affect demand because the energy industry is too dependent on it as an oxygenate and an octane enhancer, and there's just not many viable alternatives.
So what I'm hearing overall is that if you're harvesting right now, and corn especially, you could still get away with storing some in the bin rather than selling it all straight to the elevator right away.
The big problem is watch your quality, watch your toxin levels, make sure it's that. I think the cash market, if nothing else, should firm up as we go forward. If the futures don't, then I think the cash market will reward storage.
How aggressive would you be right now in trying to sell 2013 corn or soybeans? And there probably is a difference there.
What I have done is price some of what won't be covered by crop insurance next year, some of those early bushels, but watch your margins. If you can lock in input costs and lock in corn prices and soybeans, maybe a little bit makes some sense. But I'm very concerned with tight global situations. I don't think we're going to turn this thing around very quickly. I think it's going to take some time, and I think we're going to have higher prices.
And easy to say that South America is going to produce a huge soybean crop?
Well, El Nino is going to leave things dry in the northwestern half of Brazil's soybean belt. If it does go up, if they do produce, then they can't push it out through their ports. Their infrastructure and their port capacity is too limiting yet at this point.
2013 planting numbers. Farm Futures sees more of a shift to soybean acres rather than corn. They see 93.1 million acres of corn, I believe. What would lead a change there? Is there anything that you could foresee that would maybe start to push people back to corn?
The big thing we saw is Iowa, Illinois, problems with corn on corn acres after a couple years of adverse conditions. It's going to take higher prices to make it worth the risk of going corn on corn a 4th year yet on some of those acres after several years of adverse conditions.
As we've seen all summer, livestock producers have not only been battling high corn prices, but also the lack of other forages on the market. We asked John Otte if Wednesday's report, perhaps more bearish on the corn side, could be any relief for cattle and hog producers.
Corn futures retreated a little bit at the open this morning after USDA's crop report, production report, and the World Ag Supply domestic estimates came out. That does suggest relief. However, that's relative to expectations of what average traders expected the report to show. And there's a substantial contingent of analysts out there, including ourselves, that are of the persuasion that the corn market has not yet gone high enough to ration the supply with the demand that's out there for the 2012 crop. So that's a long way to answer your question, which is no, we don't think that this morning's reports provided relief for livestock producers.
So you still think there's a window then to buy corn before maybe the end of harvest where it gets tight again?
Harvest from a basis standpoint is always a good time to buy cash corn if you have someplace to stash the stuff. Sure. And with a short crop this year, there's probably a pretty good chance producers who have on-farm storage will not be able, livestock producers that is, to fill it with their own crops. So this is a buying opportunity quite likely from a basis standpoint.
Let's look at supply numbers. We know that supply last year got hit with the Texas drought. Now it's getting hit with the Midwest drought. Are you concerned about the numbers that we're going to see going into 2013 in terms of how many cattle are actually going to be there?
The U.S. beef herd, the U.S. cattle herd has been shrinking since 1976 when it peaked out at about 136 million head. We're on a decline. We're on a steady decline in cattle numbers. We're on a steady decline in beef production. We're on a steady decline in per capita consumption. People say, why are we on all these declines? And the answer is, given the cost of production in the beef industry these days, cattle producers and other folks in the beef supply chain are not getting prices high enough to balance this, to cover their cost. And so in this morning's reports, I believe USDA pegs this year's beef supply down about 1.6%, next year's beef supply down about 1.9%. And so going forward, yes, beef supplies will tighten.
No turnaround in the near future then?
Well, we had big placements in March and April of this year, and that's going to equate into rising immediate term supplies. And we have to be cautious about how we're looking at this from the long term and the short term because of those points you mentioned, Jeff, about liquidations last year. It has distorted the normal flow of cattle into feedlots. But longer term, we're looking at tighter supplies and higher prices. And the name of the game in the beef business, the hog business, and to a certain extent the poultry business, and certainly the dairy business, is to maintain liquidity and maintain cash flow, because there are better times ahead, assuming that we get lower priced feed from the 2013 crop. And so we have to make the cash flow work to get there, and we will have a very significant clue as to what 2013 crop feed prices will look like early July of next year. As we observed this year, the week of the 4th of July is often a turning point in grain markets for the weather reasons.
Sure. Pork and beef going into next year, what do you see there? Pork will arguably be more of a supply there. Do you see consumption going along with it, or is there going to be that battle again with trying to get it?
Pork supplies this year are going to be up a little bit. Pork supplies next year are projected to be down a little bit. That's driven by these higher feed prices. As of this week, we saw front month fed cattle at a 6-month high, and we saw front month lean hogs at a 2-year low. That's widening the spread between beef and pork, and making pork more price competitive. And that becomes an issue for the cattle producer from the standpoint that spread's not going to get too wide, or consumers are going to shift away beef dollars that would normally go to beef over to pork.
So fed cattle prices going into 2013 remain somewhat untethered?
USDA is projecting the U.S. average price for fed cattle for steers for next year a little higher than this year, and that's predominantly going to be driven off of tighter supplies.
Give me your thoughts on the export market, opportunities to grow there?
There's
USDA says about even, I believe.
Right, but there's been more chatter about Japan easing restrictions and taking cattle up to 30 months of age, and we've been hearing that off and on ever since 2003 when we first had the first BSE scare. And to the extent that develops, we have increasing beef export opportunities. But as we have learned in the past, sometimes on those types of things we wait to see them. Now we also have when prices are rising, importing countries seem to find fewer political reasons to block imports, and when prices are cheaper, then they find more reasons politically why they don't want to import more beef and pork. And prices, both pork and beef, are going to stay pretty pricey for quite a while. And another thing driving all of that is world population is growing, and consumers in Asia, particularly Asia, are becoming more affluent.
Next week, our market analyst will be Frayne Olson from North Dakota State. Also here at Husker Harvest Days is the Nebraska Soybean Board. We talked with Ron Pavelka about questions he received this week from producers asking about checkoff dollars.
It's a large array of things that we support here in the state, whether it be research projects through the university, livestock initiatives such as AFAN and other organizations. Common Ground is another one where we promote a lot of livestock. The biodiesel, we heavily invest in biodiesel, as well as some investments out in the northeast part of the country with some bioheat. But it was just some interesting questions that came through. It's just a good opportunity to maybe set the record straight and inform the producers who are paying that checkoff how their money is being used here in the state to benefit Nebraska producers.
The Nebraska Soybean Board was also in the news Wednesday morning as Nebraska Governor Dave Heineman announced that September is Renewable Fuels Awareness Month. We'll have more on that next week, and how a biofuel mandate in New York City will increase the market for Nebraska soybean oil. Dung beetles don't often come to mind when talking about agriculture productivity, but the September Nebraska Farmer tells you why UNL researchers in the Panhandle are looking at ways to increase dung beetles to benefit rangeland health. Research shows that dung beetles provide nutrient recycling, soil aeration, and biological control of pests. UNL scientist Sean Whipple says the work done by dung beetles increases available acreage for cattle production by 5 to 10%. You can read more about the research in the September Nebraska Farmer. As cattle producers look towards harvested cornfields as another source of feed, we asked Rick Rasby this week to discuss how farmers and ranchers should safely approach grazing on stalks this fall and winter.
Today I'd like to talk a little bit about grazing corn stalks and the nutritive value of corn stalks that we have out there. This is a drought year, and so I think there'll probably be more corn stalks grazed this year than we've had in the past. In an earlier market journal, Dr. Terry Kloffenstein talked about grazing corn stalk residue and the impact on subsequent yield, and actually, at least our data in eastern Nebraska would suggest there's an increase in yield the year after corn stalks are grazed. And so from a yield standpoint, there seems to be no negative effect. The other thing that I would say is that as long as we allow cattle to graze the husk and the leaf, which is what they'll select out there, I assume that there's not going to be a lot of corn out there. As long as we allow them to graze husk and leaf, there's not going to be a need for much supplementation other than salt and mineral. These would be cows that would calve in March that are grazing the crop residue, maybe starting now in early September up until February. There's probably no need to supplement them with protein or energy. I've had questions about nitrates in stock fields, especially after we've had a drought like we've had this year. And what I have here is I've taken a corn stalk and I've divided it up into thirds, the bottom 1/3, the middle 1/3, and then the upper third. As you can see on this stalk also is that we have an ear of corn. That looks like a pretty good ear of corn. And we have husk right here, and then we also have leaf, right? We have a leaf blade, and there's a shaft down here that would be called the leaf shaft, and that would be part of the grazing. But remember, cows are selective grazers, and they're going to want to select, if there's any corn in the field, they'll select that first, followed by the husk and the leaf, and finally the cob and the stalk. I divided this stalk up into thirds. This would be the bottom 1/3, this would be the middle 1/3, and this would be the upper 1/3 there towards the top of the camera, if you will. If there's any nitrates that are going to accumulate, they would accumulate down here in the bottom 1/3 of the stalk. So that would be really where we would not want to force cattle. The Wisconsin data would say that there's probably, in drought years, very high nitrate levels here. If you take a look at the Wisconsin data in drought years, is that the middle 1/3 and the upper 1/3 of the stalk, really their data would suggest there's less than half the toxic level here. That's less than half of the toxic level, and even less as you get to the upper third of that stalk. The other thing that I would say is that the leaves are very low in nitrates, as well as the husk are very low in nitrates. Also, the cob is very low in nitrates. So as you think about grazing from a nutrient standpoint, you want them to graze the leaf and the husk, right? Because they're the most nutritious, and don't force them down to eat the bottom part of the stalk. And so from that standpoint, you'd want to be cautious and not force cattle to graze this part, but really these parts are probably going to be okay from a grazing standpoint. Again, if you allow them to graze only the husk and the leaf, is that you're probably not going to need any supplementation other than mineral supplementation as well as salt supplementation. So with that in mind, these are really an excellent feed resource for cattle during drought years. We want to be able to source enough corn stalk residue that we don't force cattle to graze the bottom part of the stalk. As you would see right over here, you would not want cattle to be forced to graze this particular part of the stalk. As long as they have access to the upper part of the stalk, the middle part of the stalk, and the husk and the leaf, we're going to see very little detrimental effect in regards to nitrates in these stock fields. If you force them to graze the bottom part of the stalk, there is the possibility of nitrate toxicity. If you want to know how to gauge the number of days a residue field could be grazed, we have a corn stalk grazing calculator that you can find on beef.unl.edu. And those grazing days and the amount of residue that's left in the field is based on corn yield. And so bushels per acre would basically tell us the amount of residue that would be there available. The other thing that I might say is that sometimes in these fields, I've noticed that they haven't picked some of the ends and left that standing. Now, that would be a little bit of a caution to me, in that there could possibly be fairly high nitrates in that area. So make sure that if you go to a residue field and that's happened, you might want to take a look at possibly fencing that out, because I kind of think cattle will probably make their way towards that end of the field, and that could be possibly high in nitrates. But other than that, and not making sure that cows don't graze the bottom part of this stalk, these fields will be one of the resources that we'll use this winter because of the low availability of forages caused by the drought.
And at this year's Husker Harvest Days, experts from UNL invited farmers to bring in corn samples to be tested for nitrates. Stalks were tested with drops of a sulfuric acid solution, which turned black or blue in the presence of nitrates. After being cooked for approximately 30 minutes to remove the nitrates, samples were then further examined through an additional litmus test. UNL experts helped farmers interpret the results to aid in their farm management plans. Cattle producers may also need to be on the lookout for foot rot this fall. UNL Extension feedlot veterinarian Dee Griffin explains why foot rot may be more common during the fall grazing season.
Foot rot occurs when we injure the soft tissue between the toe of cattle, calves, cows, whatever. And this time of year, when we harvest stalks or harvest corn, we start putting cows out on stalks. And so the potential for them to step on a stalk and injure the space between their toes is pretty high. The organism that causes it, the actual bug, if you will, is in the intestinal tract of every cow walking the face of the earth, or every calf, either way. So every time they void feces, it's there. You put the two together, they injure the soft space between their toes, little manure, and they're going to have foot rot. As soon as you see it, it responds really well to therapy, nothing special. The bug will respond to some of the older antibiotics we've had, such as oxytetracycline, like LA200 or biomycin 200. That's an over-the-counter drug. You can pick it up from wherever you buy your medication and vaccine. Your veterinarian will have it. Sulfa tablets will work for that, but they're probably more expensive than just using a long-acting oxytetracycline. One injection ahead of the shoulders, follow the label directions. Do always check their foot to make sure that's really what it is, because you know they could have torn their toe or something else. But then leave her on a soft ground like a stall in the barn or something away from the stalks, soft grass or something, 4 or 5 days till that kind of heals over, put her back and go again.
Dr. Griffin says normally corn producers would consider shredding corn stalks, which would be easier on the cow's feet. However, with the higher risk of nitrates this year in the lower portion of the stalks, cattle would have greater access to these toxins if the stalks were shredded. And now we go back to the studio for this week's weather forecast with UNL Extension State Climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here we are again for the weekly forecast. And before we get to the main forecast, let's take a recap of this past week. And of course, the big news was we started to see a fairly robust precipitation event make its way into the state as we got into the day Tuesday. We've seen precipitation breaking out in the panhandle as we see moisture moving in from the southwest and starting to interact with the frontal boundary, moving slowly from the northern plains region down into the central plains. And as we progressed through the day on Wednesday, that moisture started to pivot toward the east, and we've seen some pretty robust totals coming out of portions of southeastern Nebraska, especially south and east of a line from Omaha to about Fairbury. 1.5 to 2.5 inch totals were very, very common. Unfortunately, as you move northwest of this region, precipitation totals dropped off more in the 1/4 to 3/4 inch range. Not a widespread in terms of heavy precipitation, but a widespread event in terms of total precipitation, and we very much welcome that. We need to see more of these type of events as we've basically been in a pretty significant drought now for the better part of a year. And we do actually have 12-month precipitation totals, even including this most recent rainfall in the northeast, that are approaching the 10 to 12 inch range. So probably 3, 4, 5 weeks of this before we'd even consider that we've undergone a pretty significant change toward a wetter pattern. But there are several opportunities to move through this next 7-day period, and hopefully that will add to the precipitation totals we've had. It'll give us a little bit additional moisture for wheat planting, and it maybe also give us a little boost to our forage crops that have been so devastated during this drought year. So let's take a look at the upper air models and see what we might expect as we go through this next 7-day period. And as we go to the upper air models for today, what you'll notice is there's a little bit of yellow here. There's a pool of moisture that's left over from, of course, the thunderstorm activity that moved through during the mid part of the week. And that is going to be lifting a little bit toward the northeast, and this frontal boundary is going to start to drop through during the weekend, and we might actually be able to intersect some of this moisture, particularly as we get into Monday. But for today, we're not expecting much in the way of any scattered precipitation outside of maybe an isolated chance in extreme southeastern Nebraska. Definitely going to be a much cooler trend than we've been accustomed to the past few weeks. We're looking at highs in the mid-70s across the northeast. potentially into the mid to upper 80s across the western portion of the state. But as we go into tomorrow, we're going to start to see that trough beginning to make its way southward. And by the late evening hours, we should see that entering northern Nebraska and generating some scattered thunderstorm and shower activity. We're looking at highs in northeast Nebraska in the low to mid 70s. Across western Nebraska, we'll be looking at probably the low to mid 80s. Now on Monday, this system really pushes its way south, where it's going to be a very raw, cool day across northern Nebraska. We may not even make it out of the 50s. We're looking at highs somewhere between 58 to probably see about 64. Good chance of scattered showers and thunderstorm activity across the eastern half of the state. Unfortunately, as you go toward western Nebraska, I don't think we're going to see quite the precipitation totals, but there is still some isolated moisture that we could see. We're looking at highs in the southeast before the front comes through that might make it up to the 80-degree mark, but overall fairly cool conditions. Now as we get to Tuesday, that low pivots its way to the east of us. In its wake, we're going to see some fairly cool conditions and might actually see some pockets of frost developing across north central and northeast Nebraska. Overall, we're looking at highs that will be around the mid to low 60s across the northeast. In western Nebraska, we'll be pushing about the mid 70s. Now on Wednesday, yet another system starts to push its way through, another reinforcing shot of cold air that might generate some showers and thunderstorm activity. Again, late during the day and the overnight hours, we're looking at highs in the northeast, 59, 62, in the southwest, 69 to 72. And as we get into Thursday, that system is right on top of us. We'll be starting to see some scattered light precipitation. Doesn't look like as much moisture associated with this system, but overall upper 50s northeast to around the mid 60s southwest. And on Friday, everything clears to the east of us. We're looking at very cool conditions. Northeast, mid-50s. Again, chance of frost activity during the morning. The west, mid-70s. 8 to 14-day forecast from next Thursday to the following Tuesday. The cold conditions continue in terms of precipitation. It looks like this latest round will end, and we will see no more precipitation during the remainder of the period.
Thanks, Al. For those who stopped by the Market Journal display at this year's show, we appreciate the many kind words expressed throughout the last 3 days. We look forward to talking with you again in the near future. Next week, Brain Olson is our market analyst. Matt Spangler looks at maximizing beef genetics for your geographic region, and will update you on the bioheat industry in the Northeast U.S. Until then, thanks for watching. For Curtis Harms, Betty Caston, and the rest of the Market Journal team here at Husker Harvest Days, I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska Lincoln Extension, where you can know how, know now. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
Animal agriculture is vital to Nebraska. Livestock production not only contributes to our food supply, but also helps our rural communities. Livestock provides revenue for schools, creates jobs, supports Main Street, and enhances the future for farm families. The Nebraska Soybean Board's Animal Agriculture Initiative works to encourage growth of responsible livestock enterprises to benefit agriculture and Nebraska.